The Assassin's Creed franchise has spent nearly 2 decades lying to your face. From mentors who secretly want you dead, to allies who were never on your side, to entire organizations built on deception. Today I'm breaking down the best villains in the series and everything that makes them tick, starting with the one who taught the franchise how to betray you, Al-Mualim. Here's the thing about Al-Mualim. He doesn't just betray you at the end of Assassin's Creed, he betrays you at the beginning. You just don't know it yet. When the first Assassin's Creed launched in 2007, Al-Mualim was your mentor, your leader, the head of the entire Assassin Brotherhood. He's the guy who strips Altair of his rank, sends him on a redemption arc across the Holy Land, and tasks him with assassinating 9 targets during the Crusades. You do every single one of those missions believing you're serving the Brotherhood. You're restoring your honor. Turns out no. Every target you eliminated was advancing Al-Mualim's personal agenda. He possessed an Apple of Eden, one of the most powerful pieces of Eden in franchise history, and he was using it to manipulate the conflicts between Crusaders and Saracens alike. The Brotherhood wasn't a righteous order fighting for freedom, it was his personal army, and every blade you buried in a target's neck was one less obstacle between him and total control of the Holy Land. The community will tell you Al-Mualim is one of the flatter villains in the series, and they're not wrong. He doesn't have the charisma of later antagonists or the philosophical depth the franchise eventually learned to write, but his simplicity is exactly why the twist works. The game hadn't taught you to distrust your mentor yet. There was zero precedent for it. Assassin's Creed hadn't established the rules it would spend the next 17 years playing by. Al-Mualim is the villain who wrote those rules. Every betrayal that followed, every hidden Templar, every ally who turned on you, all of it traces back to this moment. He's the franchise's original sin, but if Al-Mualim corrupted the Brotherhood from within, wait until you meet the man who corrupted the entire Catholic Church, Rodrigo Borgia. A man used alien technology to become Pope. I need you to sit with that for a second because Assassin's Creed 2 really just went ahead and did that. Rodrigo Borgia is based on the real Pope Alexander VI, who held the papacy from 1492 to 1503 and was already one of the most notoriously corrupt religious leaders in recorded history before Ubisoft decided to make him even worse. The real Rodrigo bought his way into the papacy through bribery, fathered multiple children, and ran the Catholic Church like a personal crime syndicate. So naturally, Ubisoft looked at all of that and said, what if we gave him a magic orb too? In the game, Rodrigo possesses not one, but 2 pieces of Eden, and uses an Apple of Eden to directly influence his own papal election. Let me explain why that's such a wild narrative choice. The game is essentially suggesting that one of the most powerful institutional positions in human history, the literal head of the Catholic Church, was obtained through precursor technology built by a civilization that predated humanity. That's not subtext, that's just text. And here's the thing, unlike Al-Mualim, who was entirely fictional, Rodrigo Borgia is a real person. You can look him up, he's in the history books, he's got a Wikipedia page and everything. This was the franchise's first attempt at taking a genuinely famous historical figure and saying, yeah, he was a Templar. It collapses the distance between actual documented corruption and science fiction conspiracy in a way the series hadn't attempted before, and it worked because the real history was already so absurd that adding ancient alien artifacts barely moved the needle. But Rodrigo has a problem, and the community has talked about this for years. He's a shadow operator. He schemes, he manipulates, he pulls strings from behind the curtain, which is effective in real politics, but makes for a slightly passive video game villain. By the second half of the story, he starts getting narratively sidelined. Players stop thinking about the Pope and start thinking about someone far more dangerous, someone with a sword instead of a staff, someone who doesn't hide behind a throne, his son, Cesare Borgia. If Rodrigo Borgia was the guy pulling strings from behind a curtain, Cesare was the guy who set the curtain on fire and kicked down your front door. And honestly, that's exactly why people remember him more. Cesare Borgia, historically known as the Valentino, was the son of Pope Alexander VI, and one of Renaissance Italy's most feared military commanders. In Assassin's Creed 2, Ubisoft took that reputation and cranked it to 11. Where his father schemed and whispered and played the long game from his papal throne, Cesare grabbed a sword, rallied an army, and came for Ezio personally. No intermediaries, no political chess, just a scarred, armored prince with a vendetta and the military resources to back it up. And that tonal shift is what makes AC2's second half feel like a completely different game. The first half is a political thriller. You're unraveling conspiracies, frequencies, identifying targets, navigating the web of Renaissance power structures that Rodrigo spent decades building. Then Cesare shows up, and suddenly it's a military revenge story. He doesn't want to outmaneuver Ezio. He wants to destroy him. Fortress armies, direct confrontations, personal hatred that you can practically feel through the screen. The kind of opposition that makes you feel genuinely hunted rather than quietly investigated from a distance. Here's the thing, his design sells it immediately. The facial scarring, the royal military bearing, the way he carries himself like someone who has never once in his life been told no. He looks like a final boss from the moment he appears on screen. Most AC villains blend into their political surroundings, hiding behind robes and council chambers. Cesare stands out in every single frame, and that's not an accident. Ubisoft wanted you to see this man and immediately understand that the rules of engagement had changed. But what really cements him is the community response. Ask AC2 fans who the real villain of that game is, and the majority will say Cesare without hesitation. Not his father, not the Pope who literally wielded 2 pieces of Eden, the son. And the reason is simple. Players don't want to chase a shadow. They want someone who gets in their face, someone who hates the protagonist as much as the protagonist hates them. Rodrigo was a target, Cesare was an enemy. There's a massive difference, and it speaks to what the fanbase actually values in an AC antagonist. Not complexity for its own sake, presence, threat, the feeling that this person wants you dead and has the means to make it happen. That visceral, personal opposition is exactly what elevates a good villain into a memorable one. Which brings us to an antagonist who took that concept even further. Someone who wasn't just the hero's enemy, but shared actual blood with the protagonist. Haytham Kenway Assassin's Creed 3 does something no game in the franchise had ever done before. It hands you the controller, lets you play as a charming, competent, well-dressed British gentleman for several hours, lets you get comfortable with him, lets you genuinely like the guy, and then casually reveals he's the Templar Grandmaster. You've been the bad guy this whole time, and honestly, you didn't even mind. That bait and switch alone would earn Haytham a spot on this list, but the real reason he matters has nothing to do with the twist. It's what comes after. Because Haytham Kenway is the first antagonist in Assassin's Creed history who you cannot simply dismiss as wrong. Every villain before him operated on a pretty clean formula. They wanted power. They used pieces of Eden to get it, and you stabbed them in the neck during a dramatic cutscene. Haytham doesn't want power for its own sake. He looks at the chaos of colonial America, the violence, the corruption, the complete inability of anyone to govern themselves without setting something on fire, and he concludes that centralized Templar control would genuinely improve people's lives. Not his life, everyone's. He sincerely believes that order, structure, and hierarchy will protect people from their own worst impulses. And the worst part is, he makes a genuinely compelling case for it. Some players walked away from AC3 quietly questioning whether the assassins were actually the good guys, which is, not ideal for a franchise called Assassin's Creed, but here's where it gets personal. Haytham isn't just Connor's ideological opposite, he's his father. Every philosophical argument they have carries the weight of a family that never got to exist. Connor fights for freedom and individual choice. Haytham fights for control and collective stability. Neither one is entirely wrong, and neither one can back down without betraying everything they stand for. Their conflict isn't a boss fight, it's a custody battle over the soul of an entire continent, fought between 2 people who might have loved each other if the world had been kinder. That emotional core is what elevates Haytham above a thought experiment. Pure ideology is interesting. Ideology that's destroying a father-son relationship in real time is devastating. The community remains split on whether AC3 fully delivers on this promise. Some players call Haytham the franchise's most philosophically mature antagonist the moment AC villains stopped being cartoon evil and started being genuinely uncomfortable to fight against. Others argue the game introduces this incredible ideological tension and then doesn't explore it deeply enough, letting certain characters steal focus when Haytham should have been commanding every major beat. Either way, he permanently changed what an Assassin's Creed villain could be. Before Haytham, you never questioned whether the assassins were right. After him, you couldn't stop. And speaking of stealing Haytham's spotlight, let's talk about the man who arguably did exactly that. Charles Lee. Every franchise has the enforcer, the guy who doesn't sit in a chair debating philosophy. He's the one kicking down your door at 3 a.m. because the guy in the chair told him to. In Assassin's Creed 3, that's Charles Lee. Now here's the thing about Lee. He's loosely based on the real British general from the Revolutionary War, but Ubisoft took some pretty massive creative liberties with his portrayal. The historical Charles Lee was a complicated, somewhat incompetent military figure who switched allegiances more than once. The in-game Charles Lee is a sneering, arrogant Templar enforcer who exists to make your blood boil every time he opens his mouth, which is not exactly the same thing. And honestly, that's kind of the point. Lee isn't designed to make you think. Haytham already handles that. Lee is designed to make you want to put your controller through a wall. He's the living proof that even if Haytham's Templar philosophy sounds reasonable over a cup of tea, the people actually carrying it out on the ground are brutal authoritarians with zero interest in nuance. He embodies colonial military aggression at the street level. Every act of Templar oppression Connor witnesses, Lee's fingerprints are on it somewhere. His assassination is one of AC3's major narrative sequences, and it does carry weight. Connor's pursuit of Lee spans multiple chapters and territories, building a personal vendetta that gives the game's second half its momentum. The problem is that personal vendetta against arrogant military guy is about as deep as it gets. There's no philosophical revelation waiting at the end. No moment where Lee forces you to question your assumptions. You hate him from the first cutscene, and you hate him in the last one. Mission accomplished, but also that's it. This brings up AC3's biggest structural gamble, the dual antagonist system. You've got Haytham handling the brain and Lee handling the fist. In theory, this should create a villain dynamic where intellectual threat and physical threat work in tandem. In practice, the community largely agrees it weakens Lee specifically. He becomes the less interesting half of a split that didn't need to happen. Haytham could have carried the entire game's antagonist duties alone, and most players would have been happier for it. But Lee serves a necessary function even if he doesn't serve it memorably. He's the answer to anyone who listens to Haytham's speeches and thinks maybe the Templars have a point. Lee is the point. The point is a boot on your neck. Still, a functional villain and a great villain are two very different things. And if you want to see what happens when a Templar antagonist tries to weaponize an entire revolution instead of just enforcing one side of it, Germain takes that concept to a completely different level. Francois Thomas Germain. Germain is the scariest type of villain in Assassin's Creed, and most people never even noticed. Not because he's subtle, because the game he's in literally didn't work. Let me explain. Francois Thomas Germain is the primary antagonist of Assassin's Creed Unity set during the French Revolution, and his entire strategy boils down to one terrifyingly simple idea. Why fight the people when you can become the people? Germain doesn't oppose the revolution. He doesn't try to crush it or suppress it. He hijacks it. He takes the genuine rage of an oppressed population, the real grievances of real citizens, and he funnels all of that fury directly into Templar objectives. Thousands die in revolutionary violence, and every single death serves his agenda. Here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. On the surface, Germain's goals look identical to liberation. He wants the old power structures torn down. He wants the monarchy dismantled. He wants the common people to rise up and seize control. These are objectively good things. The problem is that every bit of it is calculated. The chaos isn't a side effect. It's the product. Every guillotine drop, every riot, every stormed barricade is a Templar operation wearing a revolutionary mask. And that creates a question the franchise had never really asked before. How do you fight an enemy whose stated goals are indistinguishable from freedom? When the Templar playbook literally reads like a populist manifesto, where does the conspiracy end and the authentic movement begin? You can't tell. That's the point. Germain weaponizes the inability to tell. No other antagonist in the series pulls this off. Rodrigo Borgia hides behind the church. Haytham Kenway, at least, has the decency to openly disagree with the assassins. Germain? Germain stands in the middle of a crowd screaming for liberty, and he's screaming the loudest. He's not infiltrating the revolution, he is the revolution, and the revolution is him. Good luck drawing a line between those two things, but here's the tragedy. Germain exists inside Assassin's Creed Unity, a game that launched in 2014 with characters whose faces were literally missing, eyeballs floating in skinless skulls, frame rates dropping into single digits. The internet turned Unity into a meme before most players ever finished the tutorial, let alone engaged with the story's actual themes. Germain got buried under an avalanche of bug compilations and refund requests. He's the franchise's great what-if villain. A genuinely compelling concept. A strategy that's more relevant now than it was in 2014, trapped inside a game that nobody wanted to defend. The ideas are all there. The execution environment just wasn't. Which is a shame, because the next villain on this list had zero such excuses. Crawford Starrick. Every other Templar on this list wanted to control people through ideology, religion, or military force. Crawford Starrick looked at all of that and said, why bother when you can just buy everything? And honestly, he had a point. Starrick is the primary antagonist of Assassin's Creed Syndicate, set in 1868 London, and he's the Grand Master of the British Templar Order during the height of the Victorian industrial boom. But unlike every Grand Master before him, Starrick doesn't command armies. He doesn't manipulate revolutions. He doesn't even need a fancy speech about order and chaos. He owns the train lines, he owns the factories, he controls the banks, the politicians, the police, and when those fail, he's got the Blighters, a street gang operating as his personal enforcement arm across every borough in London. The man literally controls an entire city's infrastructure from top to bottom: transportation, labor, crime, governance. All of it feeds back to one guy sitting in a very expensive chair. Here's what makes Starrick genuinely interesting from a franchise perspective. He represents the natural evolution of Templar methodology. Cesare Borgia used armies. Germain weaponized a revolution. Starrick realized you don't need either of those things if you control the systems people depend on to survive. You don't need to conquer a population that already works for you. That's not philosophy, that's capitalism. And it's arguably more terrifying than anything a sword or a guillotine could accomplish, because the people being controlled don't even realize it's happening. His approach mirrors real Victorian power consolidation almost perfectly. Control the railways, control movement, control the factories, control labor, control the banks, control opportunity. By 1868, owning London's infrastructure was functionally identical to owning London itself. Starrick understood that before the word monopoly even entered common vocabulary. But here's where the community gets divided, and it's a fair criticism. Is a businessman villain actually compelling? Starrick controls everything, sure, but he doesn't challenge the protagonists ideologically. He doesn't make you question your own beliefs. He's not Haytham Kenway sitting across from his son debating whether freedom or order serves humanity better. He's a rich guy who wants to stay rich and powerful, which is, not ideal for dramatic tension. Some players love him precisely because he feels like a modern threat dressed in Victorian clothing. Others find him flat, a crime boss with a top hat. And that split reveals something important about what Assassin's Creed fans actually want from their villains. It's not enough to be powerful. It's not even enough to be dangerous. You need to make the player think. Starrick makes you fight through his systems, but he never makes you question yours. He's the franchise's first corporate villain in an era before corporations technically existed. Whether that's brilliant or boring depends entirely on what you think a Templar should be. But if Starrick's problem was being too pragmatic and not philosophical enough, wait until you meet a villain whose problem is the exact opposite. Flavius Metellus. Flavius Metellus isn't really the villain of Assassin's Creed Origins. I know that sounds weird considering he's literally the final boss, but hear me out. Flavius matters because of what he represents, not because of who he is, and what he represents changes everything about every single villain we've talked about so far. See, before Origins came out in 2017, the Assassin's Creed timeline had a pretty clean starting point. The Templars showed up during the Crusades, the Assassins formed to oppose them, and the whole Shadow War kicked off from there. Simple enough. Then Origins rolls up and says actually, no, the Templar conspiracy has been running since ancient Egypt, over 1,000 years before the First Crusade even happened. The Order of the Ancients, which is basically the Proto-Templar organization, was already pulling strings during the Ptolemaic dynasty, manipulating Roman military commanders and Egyptian politics like it was nothing. Flavius is a Roman military commander embedded deep within this order, and he's one of the few antagonists in the entire franchise who actively gets his hands on precursor artifacts and uses them. Not just chasing after pieces of Eden like most villains on this list, actually wielding ancient knowledge that predates human civilization, which is, not ideal for everyone else in Egypt. But here's the thing. Ask most Origins players to describe Flavius as a character, and you'll get a lot of blank stares. His personality, his motivations, his dialogue, they all kind of blur into the broader Order of the Ancient structure. He's one node in a network. You spend the entire game hunting down Order members one by one, peeling back layers of conspiracy, and by the time you reach Flavius at the end, he doesn't feel like a culmination. He feels like the last name on a checklist. And the community has been pretty vocal about this. The distributed antagonist model that Origins introduced, where you're dismantling an organization rather than pursuing one compelling individual, creates a specific problem. When your villain is a system, no single person within that system gets enough screen time to become truly memorable. Flavius has the title of Final Boss, but not the narrative weight that should come with it. That said, his real contribution to the franchise is structural. Every villain we've discussed, from Al-Mualim to Crawford Starrick, they're all part of something that was already ancient when Rome was young. Flavius is the proof. He's the character who anchors the entire Templar conspiracy in deep antiquity and forces you to reconsider the scale of what you've been fighting against for 10 games. That recontextualization is genuinely massive, even if the character delivering it isn't. The irony is that Origin's approach to villainy, spreading antagonism across an entire organization rather than concentrating it in one person, would only get more pronounced from here. And the next entry on this list takes that exact structure and pushes it even further back in time. Aspasia. Every villain on this list so far has operated within the Templar conspiracy. Aspasia built the thing it evolved from. She didn't join the Order of the Ancients. She led what came before it, the Cult of Cosmos, an organization so old it makes the Order look like a startup. And she did it from inside the household of the most powerful man in Athens. Here's the thing about Aspasia. Historically, she was the companion of Pericles, the statesman who basically defined Athenian democracy during its golden age. In Odyssey, Ubisoft took that historical foundation and cranked it to 11. She's not just advising Pericles from the sidelines. She's running an entire shadow government underneath Athenian society, pulling strings across the Greek world while the men around her have zero idea a woman is holding more power than all of them combined. And that detail matters. Ancient Greece explicitly denied women political agency. They couldn't vote, couldn't own property, and most city-states couldn't hold office. Aspasia wielded more covert influence than any elected official in Athens, which is, not ideal for the whole birthplace of democracy branding. But here's where it gets complicated. She's not some supernatural figure or Isu hybrid. She's a mortal woman operating in one of the most restrictive societies in the ancient world, and she still managed to sit at the top of a conspiracy that spanned the entire Greek world. Flavius Metellus pushed the Templar conspiracy timeline back to ancient Egypt. Aspasia pushes the philosophical roots back even further into classical Greece. She's the franchise's earliest identified ancestor of the Templar ideology, full stop. The problem is actually getting to appreciate any of this in the game itself. Odyssey's Cult of Cosmos is structured as a massive web of dozens of individual cultists spread across the entire Greek world. You spend hours and hours hunting down random cult members in caves and on beaches and in military forts, slowly working your way up branches of the organization. By the time Aspasia is revealed as the leader pulling every thread, you've already killed 40-something people who all technically worked for her. The payoff should feel enormous. Instead, it feels like finding the manager after fighting through an entire department store's worth of employees. The community is genuinely split on her. Some players praise the historical sophistication, the gender subversion, the sheer ambition of making a woman the oldest Templar ancestor in franchise history. Others argue that Odyssey's sprawling multi-faction narrative, with its mythological creatures and family drama and naval warfare all competing for attention, means Aspasia never gets the screen time her role demands. She's a shadow leader in a game with too many shadows, and that's a legitimate criticism. She's fascinating on paper, a mortal woman with no supernatural advantages, operating inside the most famous democracy in human history, wielding power that no one around her even believed a woman could hold. The concept is genuinely brilliant. The execution just needed a tighter game around it. But if Aspasia represents the franchise reaching back into ancient history for its villains, the next entry represents it reaching into something far stranger and far more personal. Basim ibn Ishaq. Every villain on this list has had one job. Al-Mualim was the betrayer, Cesare was the conqueror, Haytham was the philosopher. One role, one conflict, one era. Basim ibn Ishaq looked at that template and said, "I'll take all of them, thanks." Basim shows up in Assassin's Creed Valhalla as a hidden one, an ally to Eivor during the Viking settlement of England. He's charming, he's helpful, he's got that energy of a guy who knows way more than he's telling you but keeps smiling anyway. And for a while, you trust him because the game wants you to trust him. It's doing the Al-Mualim thing again, except this time the betrayal doesn't just flip one switch, it flips about 14. Here's where it gets complicated. Basim isn't just a guy who turns out to be working against you. He's a Viking-era rival with a personal vendetta against Eivor. He's a hidden one hunting the Order of the Ancients. While while secretly pursuing his own agenda. And he's also an Isu consciousness that has been alive across multiple lifetimes, spanning thousands of years. He's not one villain, he's 3 villains wearing the same face, and the game expects you to track all of them simultaneously. The Isu layer is where things go fully off the rails. Basim carries the consciousness of Loki, except in Assassin's Creed lore, the Norse gods aren't actually gods. They're members of a precursor civilization called the Isu, whose advanced technology got mythologized over millennia. So when I say Basim is Loki, I mean he's hosting the digitized memories and personality of an ancient being who predates human civilization, which is, a lot to process when you're also trying to raid monasteries. His motivations operate on completely different timescales depending on which layer you're looking at. As Eivor's rival, he wants revenge for deeply personal reasons tied to events the player gradually uncovers. As a hidden one, he's using the Order Hunt as cover while maneuvering everyone like chess pieces. As an Isu entity, he's pursuing objectives that span cosmic timescales and have literally nothing to do with Vikings or Templars. He's playing chess on 3 boards at once, and 2 of those boards are invisible to everyone around him. The ambition here is genuinely staggering. Ubisoft tried to create a single character who embodies every layer of the Assassin's Creed mythology simultaneously: historical conflict, Assassin Templar conspiracy, Isu science fiction, Norse mythology, modern-day implications. Basim is the franchise's entire identity crisis, condensed into one man. And depending on who you ask, that's either brilliant or a complete mess. The community is sharply split. One camp sees Basim as the most thematically rich antagonist the series has ever produced, a villain whose existence proves that the Assassin Templar War is just one tiny chapter in a conflict stretching back to the dawn of intelligent life on Earth. The other camp thinks he's an over-designed Frankenstein of plot threads, whose story didn't fully come together until Assassin's Creed Mirage, a whole separate game released 2 years later, finally gave him a proper origin story. Both camps have a point, that's the problem. His defeat doesn't even have a clean resolution. Valhalla offers multiple endings, depending on player choices, meaning his canonical fate is genuinely up for debate. And then Mirage recontextualized him entirely by making him the protagonist, which means the Basim you thought you understood in Valhalla isn't even the complete picture. It took a whole additional game to finish telling you who this guy was. Try having a definitive opinion about a villain whose own developers needed an entire second title to fully explain. But here's the thing worth sitting with. This franchise started with Elmalim, a mentor who betrayed you. One man, one twist, one sword fight on a castle rooftop. Simple, clean, effective. And it ended up here, with a metaphysical being whose motivations span millennia, whose identity is layered across mythology and science fiction, and whose story requires a flowchart to fully understand. Whether that journey from Al-Mualim to Basim represents Assassin's Creed reaching its full potential or completely losing the plot is a question I genuinely cannot answer for you. Maybe the franchise needed a villain this ambitious to match the scope of its own mythology. Maybe it needed to remember that the best villains on this list were the ones with simple human motivations and a knife behind their back. I don't know what to tell you. Sometimes a series evolves. Sometimes it just gets more complicated. And sometimes those are the same thing. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.